From the Historyogi Podcast, this is Dave. Venerable Hong Choon may not be a familiar name to many younger Singaporeans, but the former president of the Singapore Buddhist Federation played an important role in diplomacy between Singapore and China in the 1980s. Today, we speak to Assistant Professor Jack Chia from the National University of Singapore on Venerable Hong Choon's diplomatic legacy as well as the history of Buddhist advocacy in Singapore. Okay, thanks so much, Jack, for joining me today. To start off, how did you become interested in studying the history of Buddhist diplomacy in Singapore?
Yeah. Hi, Dave, and thanks so much for having me. I first became interested in Buddhist diplomacy many years ago when I was conducting research for my honors thesis. So as a Buddhist and also a history student born and raised in Singapore, the history of Buddhism in Singapore is an area of research that has always intrigued me. So in an attempt to gain greater understanding and insight into this area, I decided to investigate the role of Venerable Hong Choon or Hong Chuan, an eminent Buddhist monk in Singapore. According to my Buddhist friends and also respondents, while some devotees remember him as the supreme Chinese monk, others actually regarded him as a living Bodhisattva. And in fact, there were also rumors that how Venerable Hong Choon was a personal spiritual advisor to the then Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew since the 1960s. But this has not been verified. And of course, he's most well known for the rumor about the $1 coin, about how he advised Lee Kuan Yew to come out with the $1 coin in the 8th trigram. But I couldn't find any of this in the historical records. But however, like most Buddhists of my age, I've never known him. I've never met him in person. And in fact, when he passed away in 1990, I in fact had yet to become a Buddhist. But I have heard many interesting stories about him and his seemingly extraordinary life. So during the semester break, the summer vacation of 2006, I visited the then newly opened Venerable Hong Choon Museum at the Gongming San Pokasi Monastery at Bright Hill Road. And of course, Venerable Hong Choon was the second abbot of the famous monastery in Singapore. From the exhibits and the photograph displayed in the museum, I found that Venerable Hong Choon made 8 visits to China from 1982 to 1990. And in these visits, he met with national and religious leaders, made pilgrimages to sacred Buddhist sites in China, officiated a number of ceremonies, and in fact helped to restore the monasteries in China that were affiliated with his master Hui Quan. Interestingly, all these visits occurred before Singapore and China established formal relations in 1990. And so that got me interested to find out if Venerable Hong Choon's religious exchanges played any role in the foreign relations between the two countries. And so I framed the questions: why did Venerable Hong Choon visit China, and also what was his role in Singapore's relations with China? And that became the topic for my honors thesis, which was entitled Buddhism in Singapore-China Relations, Venerable Hong Choon and His Visits 1982 to 1990. So after completing my honors thesis, I submitted a revised version to China Quarterly, which is the leading scholarly journal in contemporary China studies. And to my pleasant surprise, both anonymous reviewers recommended my article for publication. And it became my very first published article.
So could you paint a brief picture of the history of Buddhism in post-war Singapore for us?
Yeah, sure, of course. So following the end of the Second World War, there was a flow of Chinese migrants into Singapore that resulted in the expansion of Chinese population on the island. And this also caused the number of Buddhist monasteries, monastics, and lay Buddhists to increase at a rapid rate. So therefore, the British colonial government at that time requested the establishment of an umbrella, a body to represent the Buddhist community in Singapore, and also to serve as a bridge between the colonial authorities and the various Buddhist institutions on the island. So on July 31st, 1949, Lee Choon Sing, a prominent lay Buddhist and leader of the Chinese community, invited representatives from all Buddhist temples in Singapore to discuss the formation of the Singapore Buddhist Federation at the Singapore Buddhist Lodge. So a few months later, in October 1949, the Buddhist Federation was officially registered. The management committee at that time consisted of 5 monastic and 5 lay members. So Lee Choon Sing, who was the wealthy lay Chinese businessman, was appointed the chairman, and Venerable Hong Choon, that I briefly mentioned earlier, who was then already a prominent monk and abbot of the Gomeng San Pokasi Monastery, was elected as the vice chairman of the Buddhist Federation. So at the inaugural meeting of the Singapore Buddhist Federation, Lee Choon Sing emphasized the 5 guiding principles of the Singapore Buddhist Federation. That is to promote world peace, promote the Buddha Dharma, expand Buddhist education, carry out welfare activities, and also improve the quality of the Sangha in Singapore. So during Lee Choon Sing's tenure as the chairman of the Singapore Buddhist Federation, the Federation actually played an important role in promoting the interests of the Buddhist community and engaging with the British colonial authorities. And I think the most significant achievement by the Buddhist community and, of course, the Singapore Buddhist Federation at that time in the post-war period was the movement to lobby for Vesak to be recognized as a public holiday in Singapore.
Now, you argue that Buddhist activism in Singapore has little to do with religious modernity and that it was not always directed at social and political change or world peace, as people popularly believe. Singapore's government is also wary of religious lobbying. So what did local Buddhist activists focus on?
So from the beginning of 1970s, the Singapore Buddhist Federation, under the leadership of Venerable Hong Choon, and also other monastics, took on a more proactive role in promoting the so-called defending the Dharma movement. So then the Singapore Buddhist Federation played an important role in lobbying the government to censor foreign films that either contain blasphemous, so-called blasphemous contents or misrepresented Buddhist teachings. The first Buddhist Federation-led activism took place in August 1970 to protest against South Korean film Dream, which they claim insults Buddhism, corrupts morality, and poisons people's mind. So in order to protect the integrity of the Buddhist community, the Singapore Buddhist Federation submitted a petition to the Board of Film Censors to suspend the screening and to authorize the Buddhist Federation to review the film. And subsequently, the film was banned in Singapore. And over the next few years, the Singapore Buddhist Federation succeeded in lobbying the Singapore Board of Film Censors to ban several other films, including Monks, The Four Great Elements Are Empty, Breast Reviewing Nuns, and the Kana Prayer Mat, among others. So besides playing an active role in rallying Buddhists to defend their faith and correct religious misrepresentations, Buddhist activists were also concerned with social activism. So for instance, Venerable Yen Pei was one of the prominent socially engaged monks involved in the dissemination of Buddhist teachings and welfare works. His social activism can be categorized into 3 main areas: elder care and filial responsibility, organ donation and kidney dialysis, and drug prevention and rehabilitation. So these were some of the things that the Buddhist activists were engaging in the post-independent period.
Now, one of the tensions in Buddhism today is controversy over alleged unorthodox practices. How did the Singapore Buddhist Federation handle such disputes from the 1970s onwards?
Yeah, so during the 1970s, the Buddhist Federation played an important role in so-called defining orthodox Buddhist practices in Singapore. So at that time, the arrival of several new Buddhist movements, as what scholars usually call them new Buddhist movement, but among Buddhist practitioners, sometimes they will call them like Buddhist quote-unquote cult. So that was the time where we actually saw the arrival of new movements to Singapore, and that became a concern for the Singapore Buddhist Federation. So the Buddhist community could not lobby the government to ban religious groups and practices that they deemed to be unorthodox as freedom of religion is guaranteed under the Singapore Constitution. So therefore, the Buddhist Federation used the defense of the Dharma as a pretext to generate awareness of the unorthodox belief and practices of these so-called questionable groups and warn Buddhists against taking part in their activities. So, for example, the Singapore Buddhist Federation calls Yi Guan Dao and so-called evil cult and also an imitation of Buddhism at that time, and warns Buddhists against becoming members of the group. And in another instance, the Singapore Buddhist Federation received a petition signed by Buddhist nuns in April 1996 to protest against the unorthodox attire of Buddhist nuns from the Renchen Buddhist movement. At that time, the Singapore Buddhist Federation chairman, who was a Venerable Long Choon, met with members of the committee and issued a letter to Renchen Buddhist movement requesting them to abide by the orthodox dress code in accordance to the Vinaya, which is the Buddhist discipline code of conduct, and to stop damaging the image of the Sangha. And another prominent religious movement that arrived in Singapore was Falun Gong. Falun Gong was, of course, some of us are quite familiar with Falun Gong, was a new religious movement that was actually condemned and banned by the People's Republic of China government in 1999, but it spread to many other parts of the world, including Singapore. And when they arrived in Singapore, they registered their organization as Falun Buddha Society and was actually permitted to conduct its activities. As a result, the Singapore Buddhist Federation published a public statement titled "The Name of Buddhism Should Not Be Abused" to criticize Falun Gong for using the name Buddha in their organization. And they demanded the Falun Buddha Society to remove the word Buddha from the organization's name.
And did the organization remove the name?
Oh, they didn't. No, they did not. So it's still registered as Falun Buddha Society.
Now, earlier you mentioned that in your research, you uncovered the story of Venerable Hong Choon, who was the president of the Singapore Buddhist Federation. And you also mentioned that he led several key exchanges with Buddhist leaders in China in the 1980s, particularly when China was opening up during the Deng Xiaoping era. What was the role of religion in these exchanges and why were they so important?
So when Malaysia established formal diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China in May 1974, the Singapore government did not follow Malaysia's lead. At that time, Singapore was actually highly sensitive to Indonesia's negative disposition towards China after the 30th of September movement in 1965, and also making it a policy not to establish official ties with China until the Indonesian government had done so. And therefore, Singapore only formalized relations with China quite late in October 1990, a year after Indonesia. But following the normalization of China-Malaysia relations in 1974, Singapore's foreign minister at that time, S. Rajaratnam, actually led the first official visit to China in March 1975, which actually paved the way for Singapore's Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew to make his first visit in May 1976, during which he actually met the dying Mao Zedong. So after Mao passed away, Deng Xiaoping became the new political leader of China and visited Singapore in 1978. And Deng Xiaoping had seen China's economic future in Singapore and in fact considered Singapore as his preferred model for economic growth. So by the 1980s, Singapore government began to play both advisory and investment roles in China's economic modernization. And of course, economic interests and interactions contributed to a multitude of contacts between the Chinese and Singaporean leaders, with Lee Kuan Yew visiting China in 1980, 1985, 1988, and his final visit as Prime Minister, in fact, in 1990. But in the 1980s, there was also informal diplomacy that was going on that was actually, in fact, unknown to many Singaporeans. During the 1980s, Venerable Hong Choon, who was the president of the Singapore Buddhist Federation and abbot of the Gongming Sanpokasi Monastery, was considered the most prominent Chinese Buddhist monk in Singapore. And in fact, some Singaporean Buddhists consider him as the so-called state advisor or 国师, given that his close friendship with then Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew. And as I mentioned earlier, there was this interesting urban legend about Venerable Hong Choon and the Singapore $1 coin story. So between 1982 and 1990, Venerable Hong Choon made 8 visits to China, where he actually met national leaders such as China's Vice President Wu Lanfu, as well as Buddhist leaders from the Buddhist Association of China, such as Zhao Puchu and the Panchen Lama. And he also made pilgrimages to sacred Buddhist sites, helped restore the monastery associated with his teacher, Venerable Hui Quan, and also officiated at religious ceremonies at numerous prominent monasteries. But more importantly, in 1988, Venerable Hong Choon invited Zhao Puchu, the chairman of the Buddhist Association of China and vice chairman of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, to visit Singapore. So although the visit was supposed to be a religious visit hosted by the Gomeng-san Pogasi Monastery and the Singapore Buddhist Lodge, it turned out to be an informal diplomatic mission because of Zhao Puchu's status as a vice chairman of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference. The Singapore government received Zhao Puchu as a Chinese politician. So Zhao Puchu, accompanied by Venerable Hong Choon and Venerable Gong Hiap, had actually audiences with important Singaporean political leaders, including then second Deputy Prime Minister Ong Teng Cheong and Zhang Jukun, who was the Minister of State for Community Development. And on October 3rd, 1990, China and Singapore established formal diplomatic relations at the United Nations complex in New York. And a few days later, Venerable Hong Choon made his last visit to China to officiate the reopening of Chen Tian Monastery. 2 months later, he passed away in Singapore. But it's important to think about this 9 years of mutual religious of exchanges and contact as an important platform that actually contributed to cordial relations between Singapore and China and between the two countries' Buddhist organizations and leaders in particular.
You're currently researching Buddhist diplomacy as a soft power tool in secular Asian countries during the Cold War and the post-Cold War period. Why is it important for us to understand such transnational religious links?
Yeah, so I am quite lucky. I recently received the Social Science and Humanities Research Fellowship from the Social Science Research Council to work on my new project entitled Diplomatic Dharma, Buddhist Diplomacy in Modern Asia. My current research focuses on Buddhist diplomacy as a soft power tool in secular Asian countries during the Cold War and the post-Cold War period. I hope that this project can contribute to both the fields of Buddhist studies and Asian studies. It will be the first large-scale study to provide empirical evidence on the lesser-known relationship between Buddhism and international relations in modern Asia. And I aim to explore Buddhist diplomacy in 2 East Asian countries, China and Japan, 2 Southeast Asian countries, Myanmar and Singapore, and with a Buddhist majority population, as well as India, which is home to Buddhist sacred sites. I think it's important to actually move away from this assumption, this misconception that Buddhism is politically inactive and therefore not an important part in foreign relations. My project hopes to offer comparative insights on the use of Buddhism as a soft power tool to promote cultural, economic, and religious relations in secular Asian countries during the Cold War and also the post-Cold War period. And I think that understanding transnational religious links can inform policymakers on religious exchange and dialogue and identify ways to prevent negative so-called foreign influence that might affect a religious harmony and social cohesion in the region. And I think turning the attention to the role of religion in international relations can lead to better understanding of how cultural exchanges, interfaith dialogues, and regional engagements can be better attained. My research also aims to add another dimension to understanding Singapore's foreign policy by shifting the focus to investigate the role of religion in international relations and confidence building. And it hopes to complement the growing local research on religious diversity and harmony, which tends to, I think, to focus on contemporary issues as opposed to the use of religion in the promotion of cultural diplomacy and exchanges in the region. And therefore, I hope that my research can help us better understand the complicated and dynamic relations between Buddhists, non-Buddhist, and state actors in these religious exchanges and transnational networks. Yeah.
I was wondering whether I could ask a question about how your research may help us understand what's happening in Myanmar now, for example.
Yeah, so in terms of Buddhist nationalism, this is an area that is in fact a growing area of interest among scholars of Buddhism in recent years. Yeah, in the past, most people tend to associate Buddhism with peace and loving kindness, but in fact, unknown to many, there are also many Buddhist nationalists and in fact ultra-nationalists in Asia that actually is in a way promoted so-called hate speeches and racist ideas that actually resulted in religious tensions in many parts of the world. And of course, we have seen the so-called the rise of Buddhist nationalism, not only in Myanmar but also in southern Thailand as well as in Sri Lanka, and also the kind of tensions and conflicts between Buddhist majorities against the religious and racial minority. But it's also important to note in the Asian context that very often race and religion are often conflated. So we see the kind of tension and conflict in two ways. One is, of course, the kind of racial tension between the so-called religious majority, which are the Buddhists, against the religious minority. But at the same time, they are also the ethnic majority against the ethnic minority. So this is something that I think we have to take note of and pay attention to. And of course, something, it sounds a bit cliche, in Singapore. And of course, July 21st is coming in Singapore. We celebrate, racial harmony day, and very often we sometimes forget that how important it is to have religious harmonious country where we respect other different faith, different cultural practices. And this is sometimes that we have, I feel as Singaporeans, sometimes I feel that some of us have taken this for granted and we have not seen the real actual tension and conflict that are actually going on in our neighboring country and in fact in many parts of the Asian region. And of course, Buddhist nationalism and in fact Buddhist violence is an area that I feel deserve more scholarly attention there. And I'm glad that some of my colleagues in Buddhist studies are paying more attention to this area.